The city was a canvas of muted greys under the bruised twilight sky, the kind of evening that seemed to exhale a silent unease. It was 6 days since the chilling news of Rose Cotter's demise had swept through the underbelly of the city, a death that had not only taken her life, but had also given birth to a sinister phenomenon. The cursed Joel, a man teetering on the precipice of sanity, was now an unwilling vessel for a malevolent entity, the Smile Entity. This entity, it seemed, was a parasite of the most horrific kind, a contagion that moved through the shadow of death itself. Driven by a desperate need to rid himself of the encroaching darkness, Joel concocted a plan as twisted as the smile he was being forced to bear. He sought out the dregs of society, those whose lives were as corrupted as his own, hoping to pass on the curse by creating a new witness. In a dingy back alley, the air thick with the stench of stale beer and desperation, he confronted a drug dealer named Louis Fregley, a man whose soul was as fractured as the cracked pavement beneath their feet. A firefight erupted, a cacophony of gunshots echoing between the brick buildings. Joel, in his manic attempt to control the chaos, accidentally shot a witness, another unfortunate soul caught in the web of the curse. Panic clawed at Joel's throat as he saw the life drain from the eyes of the witness, and the terrifying smile bloom on Louis's face. He was too late, the curse had latched onto another. Louis was now a carrier, the horrifying smile plastered across his face like a grotesque mask. Joel's fate, however, was sealed when he tried to flee. A truck, a metallic behemoth of death, roared onto the scene, its tires crushing Joel beneath its weight, ending his cursed existence in a bloody mess. But the entity was far from done. It had found a new playground of despair. Meanwhile, in the gilded cage of celebrity, Skye Riley, a pop star whose name once glittered on marquees across the world, was clawing her way back to the surface. Her public image, once pristine, had been tarnished by a very public struggle with addiction and the tragic car crash that claimed the life of her actor boyfriend, Paul Hudson. Skye, haunted by the ghost of her past, sought solace in the sterile world of rehearsals and forced optimism. She was a prisoner of her own making, constantly watched by her diligent assistant, Joshua, and her mother manager, Elizabeth, who saw her not as a daughter, but as a prized asset. Despite the watchful eyes, Skye's demons still danced in the shadows. During a grueling rehearsal, a sharp pain shot through her back, a physical manifestation of her internal turmoil. The pain, like a siren call, led her down a dark path. She snuck away, defying the watchful gaze of her minders, and found herself in the company of Louis, a man whose life had recently been twisted into a macabre performance. It was in his squalid apartment, the air thick with the aroma of stale cigarettes and decay, that Skye witnessed the horrifying transformation. Louis, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own, screamed and panicked before collapsing, convulsing as if a rabid animal had taken residence in his body. Then, his features contorted into the unnerving smile as he rose, his movements no longer his own. In a gruesome act of self-mutilation, he grabbed a barbell plate and smashed his own face into a pulpy mess. The sound, like cracking bones and tearing flesh, echoed in Skye's mind, an unending symphony of horror. The memory, like a festering wound, would soon become an open gate for the entity to enter her life. Fear, cold and clammy, gripped Skye. In a moment of selfish desperation, she fled the apartment, leaving Louis's mutilated corpse in the room. She was not thinking about saving him, but of saving herself, not wanting to be found in the midst of drugs. The guilt, however, was a venomous serpent that would coil around her heart and never let go. The next morning, she noticed it for the first time, that unnerving smile that she now found on the faces of strangers. It was always brief, almost imperceptible, but each glimpse sent a chill down her spine. The world around her was beginning to twist, to morph into something grotesque. Her mental health, already fragile, started to crumble under the weight of the new terror. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford, as the smile haunted her every waking moment and seeped into the world of her dreams. Needing desperately to cling to any form of normalcy, Skye sought out her estranged friend Gemma, the one person she had once thought she could trust. But even as they reconciled, a chilling text message from an unknown number landed on her phone, a message that confirmed her darkest fears. "I know you were at Louis's. You are in danger." The world was closing in on her, and she knew, with bone-chilling certainty, that she was not just imagining things, that the smiles were no mere hallucination, but a real and present threat. At a fundraiser, amidst the empty chatter of the privileged and powerful, Skye's grip on reality began to fray. The teleprompter seemed to mock her, stalling as if controlled by an invisible hand, and she launched into a rambling tirade, her carefully constructed persona shattering into pieces. She began to see things that were not there, like Paul, who she had thought dead, standing among the crowd, his face contorted into that same horrifying smile. Panic, like a wild animal, seized her. In her terror, she accidentally injured an elderly guest, a physical manifestation of the chaos that was consuming her mind. The entity was not only messing with her mind, it was manipulating reality itself. Desperation led her to the darkness, to a bar where she met Morris, a man whose eyes held a similar haunted quality. He was no stranger to the entity, for it had claimed his brother long before it claimed her. He knew it, not as a sickness or a figment of imagination, but as a parasitic evil that feeds on death. He explained to her that the curse is passed on to a new host when a death is witnessed. His research led him to believe that, like a parasite, the entity could not survive without a host. He had a plan, a dangerous and desperate one, to stop Skye's heart for a short time and then resuscitate her, hoping that this would sever the entity's connection to her. But Skye, clinging to the last vestiges of sanity, refused. She was unwilling to risk death, even if it meant escaping the terrifying smile. As she walked away, the weight of her burden was growing. Returning to her apartment, her mind collapsed under the constant pressure. The shadows danced, the walls seemed to breathe, and the faces in her apartment contorted into those same terrifying smiles. Skye's backup dancers, faces that had once been familiar and comforting, now stood before her with distorted faces, their smiles sharp and cruel, a grotesque parody of friendship. The entity was morphing, taking on different forms to torment her. She tried to escape, but the entity was relentless. She was violently thrown across the room, pinned down, and then a large, grotesque arm emerged from the shadows, forcing itself into her throat, choking the life and sanity out of her. Then, darkness, a merciful blanketing over her terror. The following events would unravel to be more than a hallucination. Skye's mind replayed the events that led her to this moment. The memory of the car crash that killed Paul was no accident, but a deliberate act of desperation during a drug-induced argument. Skye, for the first time, had to face the fact that she was not only a victim, but also a perpetrator. She had caused the death of the man she loved, and the guilt, like a heavy chain, dragged her down into the depths of despair. When she came to, she was in a retreat, a place that promised healing, but offered only cold indifference. She was immediately thrown into a disagreement with her mother about the upcoming tour, the pressure of which was crushing her. Suddenly, Elizabeth, her mother, gave Skye that unnerving smile, and in a horrific turn, she smashed a mirror and used a shard to stab herself in the throat. Skye tried to leave, but to her horror, saw in the reflection of a mirror that it was her own hands that had committed the gruesome act. The entity was not just tormenting her, it was using her as a puppet. She fled the retreat, desperate and terrified, and sought refuge with Gemma. But even this small measure of solace was soon ripped away from her. The Gemma who had been with her was not the real Gemma, but a terrifying doppelganger sent by the entity. The true Gemma called her, revealing the sinister game the entity was playing. Skye, regaining control of the car that she stole, sped to the abandoned Pizza Hut to meet Morris. There, they hoped to carry out their plan to temporarily stop her heart. Using the walk-in freezer to protect her brain from damage, they were at the end of their rope, willing to gamble with death to escape the grasp of the entity. But the entity, as always, was one step ahead. When Morris left temporarily, the entity appeared before Skye, but not in the grotesque form it had taken before. Now it took on the form of Skye herself, the Skye that was in the car during the fatal crash, the one full of rage and despair, the one that had killed Paul. After a grueling struggle, Skye managed to fight off the entity and, with trembling hands, injected herself with the syringe meant to stop her heart. But death was not a gateway to freedom, and the entity knew it. The entity's true goal was not to torture Skye to the point of madness, but to claim her soul. It spoke to her mockingly, its voice a chorus of terrifying whispers, assuring her that she was not in control, that the entity had already taken her. And in that moment, the facade of the world around her shattered. Skye found herself on stage, in the dazzling lights of Herald Square Garden, as though none of the events had taken place. The people she knew, Joshua, Darius, even Elizabeth, who she had seen die, were in the audience, their faces smiling with a macabre glee. The entire day, every terrifying event, had been an illusion, a twisted nightmare orchestrated by the entity. The stage seemed to melt away, the lights turned harsh, and then the entity appeared, not in a disguise, but in its true, horrifying form. A skinless, grotesque creature, its multiple mouths smiling within each other. Skye screamed, a sound that was lost in the deafening noise of the crowd, as she fell into a trance, her body no longer her own. She watched in horror as the entity tore her mouth open and crawled inside, taking over and possessing her body. To the horrified audience, it simply looked as if she collapsed while choking. Then, Skye stood up, no longer the frightened pop star, but a vessel of pure evil, a puppet whose strings were held by the entity itself. A sickening grin spread across her face as she pulled out the microphone and plunged it into her eye, a final, horrifying act of self-destruction, a sacrifice to the entity as thousands of horrified spectators watched in terror. The concert hall fell into chaos, screams and wails filling the air as Skye's body lay still on the stage, her soul devoured, her final performance an act of ultimate horror. The entity was free to find a new victim, its evil a curse that was not easy to be broken. The smile, now more than just a twisted expression, was a mark of death. This tale, a blend of psychological horror and gruesome terror, was a story about a cursed entity that was a parasite. It didn't just kill, but corrupted and twisted, manipulating and mocking its victims until they were but a shell of their former selves. It was a story about a smile that was not an expression of happiness, but of impending doom, a tale of a world where even the most ordinary things become the stuff of nightmares.